It is 3 o'clock in the morning. A groom slips into a darkened room. His bride is already asleep, so exhausted by the chaos of an unwanted wedding that she could not even stay awake to greet him. He stands in the dark and watches a stranger who is now, inexplicably, his wife. Before we proceed, please subscribe and turn the notification bell. Now let's continue. The house had gone quiet in the way that houses do when a celebration finally exhausts itself. Lights still strung outside, flowers still pinned to the door, the faint smell of attar and cardamom hanging in the corridor like a guest that had not yet left. Inside the room, there was only darkness, and in the darkness, she was already asleep. Ayaan stood at the threshold for a moment, his hand still resting on the door. He had half expected her to be sitting up, waiting, nervous, formal, braced for whatever came next. He had prepared himself for that. He had not prepared himself for this. For the sight of her curled slightly on her side, her dupatta still draped over her shoulder, her breath rising and falling with the slow, complete surrender of someone who had simply run out of the energy required to stay awake and afraid. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him without a sound. He didn't turn on the light. There was no reason to. He crossed to the other side of the room and set his things down and stood there in the dark, looking at her the way a man looks at something he does not yet have the language for. She was not a stranger. Exactly. He had seen her before, in passing, in the peripheral way that people see the furniture of their childhood homes. She existed somewhere in the background of this house. She replied when greeted. She walked past. That was the full sum of what he knew about her, and now she was his wife, and she was asleep, and he did not know what to do with either of those facts. He exhaled slowly and went into the bathroom. The shower ran for a long time. She woke to the sound of it, the continuous fall of water in the dark, and for one disoriented second she did not know where she was. Then she did, and the knowing hit her like cold air. She sat up. Her dupatta slipped from her shoulder, and she caught it and held it and sat very still, trying to locate her own heartbeat. She had fallen asleep. On her wedding night. In a strange room, in a strange life, she had simply closed her eyes and disappeared into sleep like a child. And now he was here on the other side of that wall, and she had not even been awake to hear him arrive. Her grandmother had always said it about her. You could sleep through the end of the world. She had laughed at that once. She pressed her hands together in her lap and waited. When the water stopped, the silence that replaced it felt absolute. She heard him move. She heard the bathroom door. And then he was in the room, a shape in the low light, pausing when he saw that she was sitting up, that her eyes were open and watching him. "Assalamu alaikum," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Walaikum assalam." His was even, measured. The voice of a man who had decided, before entering this room, exactly how he was going to be. He sat down on the chair across from her, not beside her. Across from her, the distance deliberate, the message in it quiet but clear. She folded her hands in her lap and did not look away, because looking away felt like a defeat she could not afford on the very first night. The silence between them was not the silence of two people with nothing to say. It was the silence of two people with too much and no right way to begin. He spoke first. He told her that what had happened, and there was no use in either of them pretending otherwise. He told her he would take care of her, that she would not suffer, that her needs would always be met, that he knew what responsibility meant and she should not doubt his commitment to it. He told her, in the same calm and careful voice, that he had made a promise to someone in London, that this, what they were now, had not been his choice, that she should not expect from him what he was not in a position to give. She sat like a statue and listened to every word. She did not cry. She did not argue. She understood more than he knew, and more than she would ever say, that he had saved her tonight. That when everyone else had stepped back, this man had stepped forward. That gratitude and grief could live in the same breath. And tonight she would have to find a way to hold both. He said good night. He turned away. Within minutes, from the steadiness of his breathing, he was asleep. She remained sitting exactly where she was, in the dark, in the quiet, on the most important night of her life, which had asked nothing of her and given her nothing in return, except the long and patient work of learning to want less than she had always dreamed. 2 years is long enough to forget the small things, the particular creak of the third stair. The way afternoon light fell through the kitchen window at a slant and turned the whole room gold for exactly 20 minutes before moving on. The sound the gate made when it swung open, that low, familiar protest of old iron that Ayaan had grown up hearing and stopped noticing, and now, stepping out of the cab and onto the street in front of Con House, heard again, as though for the first time. He had not told anyone he was coming. That had been the plan, the small, private pleasure of watching their faces change when they saw him. 2 years in London without a visit home, and he had kept the return date to himself like a gift he was saving. He paid the driver, lifted his bag from the boot, and turned toward the house. Then he stopped. The gate was strung with lights, not the modest kind, not a string or two hung out of habit, but the full, committed decoration of a household that had been planning something for weeks. Marigolds were threaded through the iron in loops of orange and yellow. A banner had been tied above the entrance. From somewhere inside came the sound of women's voices and the low pulse of music, and the whole front of the house was lit up against the night sky like something out of a dream he hadn't known he was having. He stood on the pavement for a moment, bag in hand, recalibrating. Farida Begum saw him first. She had stepped outside for something, he never found out what, and she looked up and went completely still. For 3 full seconds she simply stared at him, as though verifying that the version of him standing at her gate was real and not some trick of the decorated lights. Then she crossed the distance between them in a way that a woman of her composure rarely moved, and pulled him into her arms without a word. By the time Imran Khan and his grandmother had come out, the surprise had completed itself. There were embraces and exclamations and the particular warmth of a family that has been missing one of its members without always admitting it. His father gripped his shoulder and held it a beat longer than necessary. His grandmother cupped his face in both hands and said nothing, which said everything. "You should have told me," Imran Khan said, when the first wave of it had passed. "I would have sent a car." "That would have defeated the purpose, Dad." His father laughed. Then Ayaan looked again at the lights, at the flowers looped through the gate, at the women moving purposefully in the rooms beyond, and asked what all of this was for. "Inaya's Mehendi is tomorrow," his grandmother said. He searched the name for a face and found only a vague outline. A girl, quiet, present somewhere in the background of this house. He had the impression of someone who moved through rooms without demanding to be noticed. "Iqbal Sahib's daughter," his grandmother added, reading his expression. "She has been living with us." He nodded as though this accounted for something, said the appropriate things, and allowed his mother to steer him inside and toward his room. He was tired in the specific way that long travel produces, not sleepy exactly, but emptied. His room was exactly as he had left it. He sat on the edge of the bed and then lay back and was asleep before he had finished the thought he had started. He did not think about Inaya again that night. He thought about her the next morning, though not in any way he would later remember as significant. He came downstairs to find the house already busy. Women arranging things in the courtyard, the smell of cooking coming from the kitchen, a general atmosphere of purposeful preparation that made him feel slightly in the way. He poured himself tea and stood near the doorway and observed, the way a man does when he has been away long enough to become a partial stranger to the rhythms of his own home. He saw her briefly. She was moving through the courtyard with something in her hands, a tray or a basket, he wasn't sure, dressed in yellow, which he supposed was appropriate for the occasion. She didn't see him, or if she did, she gave no indication of it, and he gave none either, and that was the full extent of their contact on the day before everything changed. What he learned over the course of that day, he learned in pieces from his grandmother, who mentioned it in passing. The man Inaya was to marry was considerably older, a widower, 3 children already grown enough to resent a stepmother. From the conversation that drifted through the wall of his father's study, where the men of the groom's family were meeting with Imran Khan, there had already been adjustments to what was originally agreed. Small ones at first, then larger ones, each presented as a reasonable clarification of a previous misunderstanding. From the way his mother's face looked when she brought him lunch, tight around the eyes, careful in the way a person is careful when they are trying not to say something they very much want to say. He put the pieces together quietly and did not involve himself. It was not his place. He was a guest in this moment of the family's life, returned from London after 2 years, still finding his footing. He went about his afternoon with the deliberate lightness of a man who has decided that other people's arrangements are not his business. Then the evening happened. He was in the drawing room when he heard the voices change pitch in the courtyard. Not louder, exactly tighter. The particular register of adults trying to conduct a conflict with some remaining shred of civility. He set down what he was reading and listened. The groom's family had made another demand. He gathered this not from any single sentence, but from the cumulative sound of the exchange, the false patience in certain voices, the sharp intake of breath in others. His father's tone had shifted into the register Ayaan knew well. The register of a man who has been courteous for as long as courtesy is available to him, and is now approaching its outer edge. What they said about Inaya, he heard that clearly. Unwanted. The word used plainly, without embarrassment, by someone who had come to this house as a guest and decided it gave him certain permissions. A girl no one else would take. A burden the family was lucky to be relieved of, even on these terms. The silence that followed was of the kind that precedes something irreversible. Imran Khan's voice, when it came, was very quiet. In Ayaan's experience, his father was most dangerous when he was very quiet. The alliance was over. He said it simply. The arrangement, the agreement, the entire careful architecture of the last several months, finished. The groom's family could leave. They were welcome to take their demands with them. There was protest. There was bluster. There was the sound of people leaving in the manner of people who wish to appear as though they are not fleeing. And then his father said the thing that changed everything. Ayaan heard it from the drawing room, and for a moment he was certain he had misheard, that exhaustion or distance had scrambled the words into something that only sounded like what he thought they were. He stood up. He walked to the doorway. Imran Khan was standing in the center of the courtyard. Around him, his wife, his mother, the women of the household, and Inaya, standing slightly apart from the rest, very still, her yellow clothes from the mehendi that would now never happen still bright under the courtyard lights. My son will marry Inaya. Nobody moved. Ayaan looked at his father. His father looked at him, not with apology, not with question, but with the particular steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it, and is now simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. Ayaan looked at Inaya. She was looking at the ground. What followed happened quickly, in the way that things happen when someone with sufficient authority has made a decision and the remaining participants are too stunned to mount a coherent alternative. There were hushed conversations. There were practicalities. A malvi was reached. Witnesses were gathered. The correct words were said in the correct order. Ayaan stood where he was told to stand. He answered when he was asked to answer. The Nikah was performed before midnight. He did not speak to Inaya during any of it. She did not speak to him. There was a moment near the end when he glanced across the room and found her already looking at him. Just for a second, her eyes dark and unreadable and full of something he could not name. And then she looked away, and the moment was over, and they were married. He had come home to surprise his family. He had not accounted for the possibility that his family had a surprise of its own waiting for him, larger and heavier and more permanent than anything he had carried back from London. He thought of the woman he had left there. He thought of the promise he had made. He thought of Inaya's eyes, dark and unreadable. And then he stopped thinking because there was nothing useful left to think. What had to happen had already happened. The only question now was what came after. The days that followed the Nikah had a strange, suspended quality, like the silence after a door closes, when the sound is gone but the air still holds the shape of it. They were married. The house knew it. The walls knew it. Every careful glance from Farida Begum, every deliberate cheerfulness from his grandmother, every room that suddenly emptied when both of them happened to enter it at the same time, all of it confirmed, quietly and without ceremony, that something had shifted permanently in the architecture of this household. But between Ayaan and Inaya themselves, there was nothing. Not coldness, not tension, nothing. They occupied the same house the way two people occupy a waiting room. Politely, at a distance, each very carefully not looking at what the other was doing. 3 days passed this way. On the third night, he came to the room while she was still awake. She had been sitting on the edge of the bed, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just existing in the specific state of alertness that had become her default since the night of the Nikah. She heard his footsteps in the corridor and straightened without meaning to. The way the body braces itself before the mind has decided whether bracing is necessary. He entered. He did not seem surprised to find her awake this time. He closed the door and stood for a moment, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he had come with a purpose, that whatever he was about to say, he had decided before he opened the door. He sat down, not across from her this time, but angled slightly away, his elbows on his knees, looking at the middle distance the way a man looks when he is trying to be precise. "I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want you to hear it properly, not the way things get heard when everyone is in shock." She waited. "Whatever happened between our families, whatever my father decided, I want you to know that I don't hold any of it against you. None of this is your fault. You didn't ask for this any more than I did." He paused, chose his next words the way a person selects a tool for a task that requires exactness. But I had promised someone in London that I would marry her. That promise existed before any of this. It still exists, even if the circumstances have made it impossible to keep. The room was very quiet. I'm not going to be unkind to you. That's not who I am, and it's not what you deserve. I'll take care of you properly, completely. Whatever you need, you'll have it. I want you to feel safe here. He looked at her then directly, and his eyes were not cruel. They were something worse than cruel, she thought. They were honest. But I can't give you more than that. I won't pretend that I can. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. He finished. The verdict had been delivered. Clean, considered, and final. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Not the nod of someone who agrees, or someone who is relieved, or someone who has been told something they already knew. The nod of someone who has just accepted the full weight of a thing and has decided, without drama and without collapse, to carry it. I understand, she said. 3 words, quiet as a door closing softly, not slammed, not left open, but closed with both hands, deliberately, so that whatever was on the other side of it stayed there. He nodded once in return. He moved to his side of the room, and within minutes, as had become its habit, the darkness took him. She sat with her hands in her lap and did not cry. She had known, in the part of herself where a girl keeps the things she cannot say aloud, that this conversation was coming. She had prepared for it the way you prepare for rain, not by stopping it, but by deciding in advance that you will not dissolve. She was a girl with dreams. She had always been. But she was also something that perhaps even she had not yet fully understood. A girl with a spine made of the particular material that looks like softness from the outside and holds its shape regardless. She sat with the verdict until it became familiar. Then she lay down. Then, eventually, she slept. The first thing he noticed was that she ate very little at breakfast. Not in the way of someone performing delicacy or following some self-imposed rule, but in the distracted way of someone whose mind is elsewhere and whose hands simply forget to continue. She would take a few bites, then stop, then look out of the window at something he couldn't see, and the food on her plate would go cold without her noticing. He noticed this on the second morning. He did not say anything. On the 4th morning, he set a second cup of chai in front of her without being asked, because hers had gone cold while she was looking at the window, and he had been passing anyway, and it required no particular feeling to do it. Only the basic observation that a cold cup of tea is worse than a hot one. She looked at the cup, then at him. He had already moved away. She drank it while it was still warm. These were the earliest days, the days of pure, practical coexistence, when the marriage was a fact that both of them were still learning to move around without bumping into it. They developed small habits the way people develop them when they share a space, not through agreement, but through the slow accumulation of repeated mornings, of learning which side of the sink the other person uses, of discovering that she was awake before him and that he was quieter at night than she had expected, of all the minor navigations that constitute the first cartography of a shared life. He did not try to talk to her beyond what the day required. She did not try to talk to him. But the silence between them began, almost imperceptibly, to change its quality. The silence of the first week had been the silence of two people trying not to disturb each other. The silence of the third week was something different, something that had at its edges the beginnings of ease. It was Ayaan who broke it first, though he would not have described what he did as breaking anything. They were in the garden one evening, she sitting on the steps, he passing through on his way to somewhere else, when he stopped and said without preamble, "You don't have to ask permission to go somewhere. If you want to go out, go. You don't need to wait for someone to take you." She looked up at him. "I wasn't waiting. You haven't left the house in 11 days. She had nothing to say to that, mostly because it was true, and also because she hadn't realized he had been counting. "I'm not trying to make you feel watched," he said. The correction was quick, as though he'd heard how his own words could land. "I'm saying the opposite. You're not under any obligation to stay inside. This is your home now. It should feel like one." He continued on his way. She sat with what he had said for a long time, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. "You're home now." Not said with warmth, exactly, but not without it either. Said the way a person says something they mean but haven't yet attached feeling to. 2 days later, she went out. She went to the market alone, bought 3 things she didn't need, and came back. It was nothing. It was also the first time in nearly 2 weeks that she had felt like a person who existed independently of the event that had changed her life. When she came home, he was in the corridor and she told him where she'd gone, and he said good and went back to what he was doing, but there was something in that single word, good, that she kept with her for the rest of the day. The weeks became a month. The month became 2. Small things continued to accumulate like sediment, the kind that builds so slowly you don't notice it until you look down and find the bottom has risen. He began asking in the evenings how her day had been, not in the obligatory tone of someone performing inquiry, but in the abrupt, almost impatient tone of someone who actually wants the abbreviated version. She learned to give it to him that way, briefly, directly, without preamble. He responded better to that. She filed it away. She learned other things too, that he read with the light on too late and then was unreasonably irritable the next morning, that he took his responsibilities with a seriousness that occasionally tipped into stubbornness, and that the only way around it was not to argue the point directly, but to approach from a slight angle, like correcting the course of something heavy that is already in motion. That he noticed things quietly, without comment, the way he had noticed the 11 days, the cold tea, the window she kept looking at. One evening she asked him about London. She hadn't planned to. They had been sitting in the same room, both nominally occupied with separate things, and the question came out of her in the particular way that questions come when a silence has lasted long enough to require something to fill it. He looked up. She thought he might deflect, change the subject, give the compressed version that tells you nothing. Instead, he set down what he was reading and talked. Not about the woman he had mentioned on the first night. That was a door she understood was not yet hers to open, but about the city itself, the gray of it, and the specific quality of the cold, and the way the light at 4 in the afternoon looked like the light at 7 in the morning looked like the light at 9 at night. All of them the same flat pewter gray that you either learned to love or spent years fighting. He talked about it the way a person talks about a place that made them. She listened the way a person listens when they are learning someone for the first time, carefully, without interrupting, storing the details. When he stopped, the room felt different. Not dramatically, not in any way she could point to, but different. "It sounds lonely," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "It was," he said. And then, as though the admission had surprised even him, he picked up his book again. She looked back at her own and did not smile, because smiling would have made it a moment, and she understood instinctively that he did not yet want it to be one. But she held the word quietly lonely. A man who had gone to London and built a life there and was honest enough, just now, to admit that it had cost him something. The trip was his mother's idea, which surprised everyone, including Farida Begum herself. It was framed practically. Ayaan had business to attend to in another city, and it made sense, his mother said with great casualness, for Inaya to go along. A change of scenery, fresh air, the kind of reasoning that doesn't quite hold together if you press it, but that no one pressed, because the alternative was to acknowledge what was actually being suggested. They went. The first day was careful, both of them conducting themselves with the heightened politeness of people who are away from home for the first time together and are very aware of it. They ate at a table in a restaurant and spoke about the food and the city and nothing in particular. And the conversation had the quality of something happening on a stage. But travel does something to people. It removes the furniture of their daily life, the routines, the rooms, the familiar architecture of habit. And in the space that's left, they become slightly more themselves than usual. By the second day, something had loosened. He laughed once, a real one, not the polite version, at something she said about a shopkeeper who had tried to convince her that a particular piece of embroidery was 300 years old. The laugh caught her off guard. It was different from how she had imagined it would be. Less guarded. It changed his face entirely, and she turned away before he could see that she had noticed. She told him about her father that night. Not the full story, not yet, but a part of it quietly, in the way you offer someone a small piece of a large thing and wait to see what they do with it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't say he was sorry, which was the right instinct. She didn't want condolence. She wanted to be heard, and he heard her. "You've been carrying that a long time," he said. "Everyone carries something," she said. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not pity, not the careful sympathy of obligation. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, very much like respect. They came home 4 days later. The house was the same. They were not. Nothing had been said, no line had been crossed, no declaration made. But something that had been sitting at a careful distance had moved, had shifted without announcement into a proximity that neither of them acknowledged and both of them felt. The accumulation had been so slow, so patient, so quiet. And now there was simply more of it than there had been before. And it was warm, and it was real, and it had no name yet, but it was there. They came home on a Tuesday. By Thursday, it was as though the trip had always been part of them, not a separate event that had changed something, but a door they had walked through so quietly that neither of them had heard it close behind them. The house was the same. The routines reassembled themselves. And yet something in the air between them had shifted in the way that air shifts before weather. No single degree, no visible change, just a pressure that wasn't there before. She noticed it first in small things, the way she always noticed things. He had started leaving the kitchen light on when he came down before her in the mornings. Not a grand gesture, just a light, already on, so that she didn't have to feel her way to the switch in the dark. He would already be at the table with his chai and his phone, not looking up when she came in, giving her the particular gift of a presence that didn't demand to be acknowledged. She began to feel in those mornings something she had not felt since before the night of the Nikah, the sensation of being in a space that was also genuinely hers. She started cooking on Wednesdays, not because anyone asked her to. Farida Begum's kitchen had its own established order, and Inaya had learned in the early weeks to move through it carefully, like a guest who knows the rules without being told them. But on a Wednesday 3 weeks after they returned, she made something small for the two of them. A simple rice dish, nothing elaborate, the kind of thing you make when you want to do something with your hands. She left his portion covered on the counter and didn't mention it. He ate it. He didn't mention it either. But the following Wednesday he came home earlier than usual, and she understood, without anything being said, that this was not a coincidence. That was how it worked between them now. In the currency of small, deniable things. He asked her once, in passing, whether she had ever thought about studying again, continuing something she had left unfinished. She had mentioned it only once, briefly weeks ago, in a conversation about something else entirely. She hadn't thought he was listening. He had the answer ready before she'd finished being surprised that he remembered. The name of a program, the details, delivered in the same abrupt, practical tone he used for everything, as though it were simply a logistical problem he had identified and solved. She didn't know what to do with him sometimes. He was still not warm in the way that warmth is usually performed. There were no softly spoken words, no lingering looks, no moments engineered for feeling. He remained, in his essential nature, a man of function and exactness, who expressed things through action the way some people express them through language. But she had learned to read him now. She had learned that when he refilled her chai without being asked, it meant something. That when he positioned himself in a room full of people slightly closer to her than necessary, it meant something. That when he listened, really listened, without his attention drifting, it meant a great deal. One evening they were sitting on the roof. It had become a habit without either of them deciding it. A few nights a week, after dinner, when the house had settled and the air had cooled. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they simply sat with the city spread out below them, each in their own quiet, and that too had become a kind of language. She said something that made him laugh. The Real laugh, the one she had first heard on the trip, the one that changed his face. And then he said something back and she laughed, and for a moment they were simply two people on a roof in the evening, easy with each other in the way that takes a long time to earn. The moment passed the way those moments do, gently, without conclusion, leaving no wreckage. But she sat with it long after they had come back inside, long after the house had gone quiet. She sat with the particular feeling of a woman who has been carefully not hoping for something and has just caught herself hoping for it anyway, without having decided to. It was a dangerous feeling. She knew that. She had been protecting herself against it since the first night, when he had set the terms and she had accepted them and folded her dreams away like something seasonal, necessary to store, dangerous to display. But hope, she was discovering, does not wait to be invited. It had come back into the room so quietly she hadn't heard it arrive. And now it was simply there, sitting with her in the dark, patient and persistent and entirely unwilling to leave. It started, as most dangerous things do, with something ordinary. She was in the kitchen on a Wednesday. Her Wednesday, the one that had become quietly, unofficially hers over the months of small accumulated habit. The afternoon light was doing its usual thing, coming through the window at that particular slant that turned everything gold for 20 minutes before moving on. The radio was on low. She was reaching across the counter for something, and her dupatta, the long cream-colored one she had worn 100 times, swung forward into the flame of the stove. She didn't feel it immediately. That was the thing about fire that no one told you. The first second was just warmth, almost pleasant, before the mind caught up with what the body was standing in. Then she saw it. The flame had taken the fabric the way fire takes things when it has been waiting for an opportunity. Completely, hungrily, with no interest in negotiation. It moved up toward her shoulder in the time it took her to draw a breath to scream, and the scream was still forming in her throat when the kitchen door opened. She would not be able to reconstruct, afterward, the exact sequence of what happened next. It was too fast, and fear compresses time in ways that make reliable narration impossible. What she knew was this. Ayaan was there. His hands were on the dupatta, pulling it away from her body, and then he was moving it, smothering it against the floor, pressing it down with his bare hands. And then it was over, and the kitchen smelled of singed fabric and something chemical, and she was standing with her back against the counter with her heart beating so loudly she could hear it. He straightened up. She looked at his hands. "You're burned," she said. Her voice came out strange, flattened, the way voices go when the body has used up all available feeling on something else. He looked at his hands as though noticing them for the first time. The burn ran across the inside of his right palm, and 2 fingers, red and already beginning to blister, the kind of burn that announces itself slowly and then all at once. "It's nothing," he said. "It's not nothing." He didn't argue. He let her run cool water over it, which was the right thing, and also, she understood, not the kind of concession he made easily. She kept her eyes on his hand and not on his face, because looking at his face right now felt like too much, too direct a view of something she wasn't sure either of them was ready to see clearly. The rest of the household arrived in the kitchen in pieces, drawn by the smell, or a sound someone had heard, or simply the instinct that moves people toward disturbance. His grandmother, 2 of the women who helped with the house, and then Farida Begum. She stood in the doorway and took in the scene, the burned dupatta on the floor, Ayaan's hand under the tap, Inaya standing close beside him, and something moved across her face that organized itself, as it sometimes did with Farida Begum, into blame before it had fully decided what it was. "What happened?" she said. Inaya started to answer, but Farida Begum was already looking at the dupatta and then at Inaya, and the conclusion she drew was visible before she spoke it. "How many times," she said, with the particular restraint of a woman who considers restraint its own form of rebuke, "does something have to go wrong before?" "Nothing went wrong." Ayaan's voice, quiet, from the sink, without turning around. Farida Begum stopped. "It was an accident," he said. "It could have happened to anyone. She could have. She's fine." He turned off the tap. He turned around. He was holding a cloth against his hand, and his expression was the one she had learned over these months, meant that he had decided something and would not be moved from it. "She's fine, and I'm fine, and I would like everyone to leave the kitchen now." The women left. His grandmother left. Farida Begum did not leave immediately. She stood for a moment in the doorway with the particular stillness of a woman recalibrating, and then she left too. And he addressed his hand properly after. She had found the kit, found the gauze, and he sat on the kitchen stool and allowed her to do it, which she had come to understand was its own form of trust from a man who did not naturally permit people to take care of him. She worked carefully, not speaking, and he watched her work in the way he had occasionally watched her when he thought she wasn't aware of it, with an attention that was too steady to be casual and too quiet to be named. "You didn't have to do that," she said, without looking up. "Do what?" "Burn your hand." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm not sure I had a great deal of choice in the matter." She secured the bandage and sat back and looked at it, and then, because the day had already exceeded her capacity for careful self-management, she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. Something passed between them in the directness of that look. Something that had been building for months in the currency of small deniable things and had just, in the crisis of the last hour, run out of ways to stay deniable. He didn't say it was nothing this time. He said, "Don't thank me for that." She understood what he meant. She nodded. She looked back at his bandaged hand, and the moment settled into something that was not quite resolved and not quite unresolved, but was honest in a way that their conversations had been moving toward for a long time. She thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Farida Begum came to find her that evening in the room while Ayaan was out. She sat down with the manner of a woman who has rehearsed her position and arrived prepared. What she said was not cruel in the way that cruelty announces itself. It was the subtler kind, the kind delivered with a certain sadness, as though the speaker regrets the truth they feel obligated to share. She said that she worried. That accidents seemed to follow certain people. That she hoped Inaya understood how much Ayaan had sacrificed, how bright his future had been, how differently things might have gone. She said she only wanted what was best for her son. She said the word, not loudly, but it was there beneath the surface of everything else she said. Unlucky. Inaya sat and listened. She was very good at that by now. She had built the skill over a lifetime of situations that required her to receive what was being given without collapsing under it. She kept her face still and her hands in her lap, and she did not cry, because crying would have confirmed something she refused to confirm. She didn't have to answer. The door opened. She didn't know how long he had been standing there, whether he had heard all of it or only the last part. His face told her very little, because he had gone into the register she recognized as his most controlled. The one that meant the most was happening beneath it. He stepped inside. He looked at his mother, and then he spoke, not loudly, not with the raised voice of a man making a scene, because that had never been his way, and this was not the moment to change it. He spoke in the same quiet, measured tone he used when he had decided something and wanted it understood completely. He said that Inaya was not unlucky. He said that she was, in every sense that mattered, the opposite of that. He said that she had come into this house in circumstances that were not of her making, had conducted herself with more grace than the situation had any right to expect, and had asked for nothing, not sympathy, not special treatment, not even the basic acknowledgement that what had happened to her had been hard. He said, "For me, she is my good fortune." His mother was very still. He said, "She is my life, the mother of my child, my entire world." The room went completely quiet. Farida Begum looked at her son. Then she looked at Inaya, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, without the filter of her own fear and her own grief about the future she had wanted for him. And then her eyes dropped to what Ayaan's words had just made undeniable. Inaya was pregnant. She had known for 3 weeks. She had told Ayaan quietly at night on the roof, and he had sat for a long moment looking at the city below them, and then had looked at her with an expression that she had not had the right word for at the time, and still didn't, except that it was large, and it was real, and it was entirely unguarded. He had not yet told his family. He had been waiting, she understood now, for the right moment. Or perhaps not waiting, perhaps simply holding it close a little longer. The way you hold things that are entirely yours before the world gets to have an opinion about them. The right moment, it turned out, had chosen itself. Farida Begum sat in the silence that followed her son's words, and something moved across her face. Something that reorganized itself, slowly and with some difficulty, into the shape of a woman reconsidering. It was not a transformation. It was the beginning of one. And that, for now, was enough. The baby arrived on a Thursday morning, just as the city was deciding to wake up. There was no dramatic announcement of the moment, no single breath that marked the before and after, just the particular stillness of a hospital corridor at that hour, and then a sound, small and insistent and entirely new, that had not existed in the world 60 seconds earlier and now did and always would. Ayaan was in the corridor when the nurse came to him. He had been there for most of the night, in the specific purgatory of hospital waiting, the bad chai, the plastic chair, the clock that moves differently in those places, slower and heavier, as though time itself is aware that what is happening behind the closed door is too significant to be rushed. He had his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and he had been, for the last hour, very still in the way that a man is still when stillness is the only thing available to him. When the nurse spoke, he stood up. When she told him mother and child both safe, a boy, healthy, something moved through him that he had no prepared response for. It arrived without warning and without category, larger than relief and quieter than joy and more complete than anything he had a word for. His legs carried him to the doorway, and he stopped there and looked in, and what he saw undid him entirely. He went down on his knees in the corridor, not because anyone was watching, not because it was the right gesture for the moment, but because his body made the decision before his mind could. The way the body acts when something happens that is too large to be processed standing up. He pressed his forehead to the floor and stayed there, in the humility of a man who understands in that moment that he has been given something he does not deserve and is grateful beyond the reach of language. He stayed like that for a long time. Then he got up, straightened his clothes, and went inside. She was exhausted in the way that goes beyond tiredness into something almost translucent, as though the effort of the last several hours had burned through everything unnecessary and left only the essential. She was propped against the pillows with her hair loose, and her face pale, and her eyes carrying that particular quality of a person who has just come through something enormous and is not yet sure they are entirely on the other side of it. The baby was beside her, small and wrapped, and making the small, unsteady movements of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is not yet sure of the rules. Ayaan sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his son for a long moment without speaking. The baby's hand was curled loosely, the fingers impossibly small. The nails, he noticed this with a specific kind of wonder, already perfectly formed. He reached out and placed one finger against the baby's palm, and the fingers closed around it with a grip that was both feeble and absolute, and something happened in his chest that he would not be able to describe to anyone, ever, accurately. He looked at Inaya. She was watching him with tired, happy eyes, the kind of eyes that have already cried all available tears and arrived at the other side of that into something cleaner and quieter. She had a small smile that she was not performing for anyone. It was simply there, the way things are there when they are entirely genuine. He reached out and placed his hand against her face. Then he leaned forward and kissed her forehead, gently, deliberately, in the way that means something different from all the other ways, and stayed there for a moment with his lips against her hair. "Thank you," he said, low and close and real. "My whole world." She closed her eyes. The room held the moment the way rooms hold certain moments, completely, without letting anything else in. And then he pulled back, and she opened her eyes, and he was looking at her with an expression that she knew, the one where something was arriving at the corner of his mouth before he had officially decided to let it. She recognized it from the roof on summer evenings. She recognized it from the trip. She braced herself slightly, the way you brace yourself when you know the weather is about to change. "9 more," he said. She stared at him. "To be at peace," he added with great seriousness, "I'll need at least 10. She laughed. It came out of her before she could moderate it, genuine and a little helpless, and entirely undignified for a woman who had given birth approximately 4 hours ago, and she didn't care at all. She pressed her hand over her mouth and laughed until her eyes watered, and he watched her with the expression of a man who has been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, to be the reason for exactly that sound. He was still smiling when she stopped. 10 children, she said, when she had recovered sufficiently. "I'm open to negotiation," he said, "but I want it on the record that I said 10. She shook her head at him and looked back at their son, who had slept through the entire exchange with the profound indifference of the newly arrived. Outside, the city had finished deciding to wake up. The light was coming through the hospital window, not the gold kitchen light of Wednesday afternoons, but the clear, unfiltered light of an ordinary Thursday morning that had turned out to be anything but. It fell across the bed and across the baby and across the two of them, and asked nothing of any of them except that they stay. He had planned to return to London. He understood now, sitting here, that this had always been a plan made by an earlier version of himself, a man who did not yet know what he was coming home to. That man had arrived at an airport with a bag and a surprise, and no idea that the house he was returning to would give him something that would make every previous plan feel like a sketch, provisional and incomplete, waiting for the real thing to arrive and make it unnecessary. He had stayed. He would stay. The decision had made itself so gradually that there was no single moment he could point to, only the accumulation, the slow sediment of mornings and Wednesdays and roof evenings and a burned hand and a corridor floor and this room, this light, this woman looking at their son with tired and luminous eyes. She glanced at him. He was already looking at her. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing left that needed saying. The love that had never been promised had arrived anyway, not in a declaration, not in a moment designed for it, but in the long, patient, unremarkable work of two people who had begun as strangers in the dark and had chosen each other, incrementally and irrevocably, ever since. It sounded, in the end, like laughter,